The year is 1532. In a highland compound near Cusco, a woman sleeps beside her children. Reed walls separate her household from the night. Then those walls are torn open. Men enter with foreign voices and foreign intentions. Her children hear everything but can do nothing. This scene, repeated across the Andes in the decades following Conquest, represents a catastrophe that archaeological and documentary evidence reveals was systematic, institutional, and devastating. What happened to indigenous women during the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire was not incidental to colonization. It was central to it. The evidence preserved in colonial archives, missionary accounts, and in the bones themselves tells a story of how an entire gender became a resource to be distributed, controlled, and exploited by imperial decree. The Spanish invasion of the Inca realm in the 1530s triggered immediate social rupture. Chroniclers including Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, Pedro César de León, and Sarmiento de Gamboa documented the capture and appropriation of elite women following military victories. High-status captives were taken as concubines by Spanish commanders after the fall of Cusco. Notarial records from early colonial Cusco list women allocated to conquistadors alongside land and treasure. These were not marriages in any traditional sense, they were seizures. Archaeological excavations in elite Inca palaces reveal household inventories interrupted mid-ceramic vessels, weaving tools, and domestic items left behind suggest hasty abandonment. These material traces align with documented capture events. Even skeletal remains from high-status tombs show evidence of trauma and forced displacement consistent with violent relocation. But the violation extended far beyond elite women. The encomienda system, established by royal grant beginning in the 1530s, parceled out indigenous labor and people to Spanish conquerors as rewards for service. Administrative documents from the Archivo General de Indias detail encomienda grants that explicitly included obligations of tribute and labor from entire communities. Letters from conquistadors and royal appointment papers make clear that Spanish officials treated people as resources to be distributed. Bartolomé de las Casas, in his 1552 account, catalogued the abuses he witnessed personally. He described forced sexual access by encomenderos not as isolated incidents but as consequences of systemic incentives built into colonial administration. When you grant a man control over an indigenous community and tell him to extract maximum value, women become part of that extraction. The archaeological record reinforces the documentary evidence. Cemetery demographics near early colonial towns shifted dramatically. Female skeletons from this period show increased stress markers, cribra orbitalia, enamel hyperplasia, conditions indicating severe nutritional deficiency and infectious disease. These physical signatures correspond precisely with the early decades of colonial rule. The immediate consequence was the breakdown of kinship protection. Structures that had previously safeguarded women. Traditional Inca social organization included extended family networks, communal labor arrangements, and institutions like the A class, the chosen women who performed specialized ritual and craft functions. Conquest shattered these networks. Women lost access to household food security, shelter provided by kin groups, and the social authority that came with their roles in pre-conquest society. Spanish law attempted to regulate the worst abuses, at least on paper. The laws of Burgos, enacted in 1512 and 1513, represented the first Spanish attempts to establish rules for treatment of indigenous peoples. The ordinances prescribed protections for indigenous women and children and required masters to avoid abuse. These laws survive in legal compilations and administrative correspondence, but enforcement was nearly non-existent. Letters from royal officials and missionaries, preserved in colonial archives, document persistent disputes over whether encomenderos followed any regulations at all. Archaeological studies at early mission sites reveal the gap between law and reality. Missions were sometimes shelters, but more often they were centers of control where women were resettled in ways that separated them from traditional support networks. Excavations at mission compounds around Lima and Arequipa show stratigraphic evidence of sudden demographic reorganization, population movements that don't reflect gradual cultural change but rather forced concentration of people under new authorities. The physical footprint of these institutions tells a story of control, not protection. Missionary records from the 1530s through the 1560s document aggressive baptismal programs and attempts to impose Christian marriage norms. Bishops conducted visitations and recorded complaints from women cohabiting with Spanish men under circumstances they had not chosen. Ecclesiastical courts heard cases involving contested claims of consent. Parish registers starting in the mid-16th century show a spike in baptisms of mixed ancestry children. Christian cemeteries adjacent to colonial towns expanded to include indigenous women, indicating both conversion and increased regulation of their lives and deaths. The bodily cost of conquest is written in bone. Isotopic analyses of remains from early colonial cemeteries near Trujillo and Cusco reveal dietary shifts among women consistent with sudden loss of access to protein-rich foods. Carbon and nitrogen isotope studies show nutritional decline that corresponds directly with dispossession and forced relocation, documented in colonial tribute records. Census data from the 1570s reveals population collapse and demographic imbalances. Some communities showed severely skewed sex ratios, combined with legal petitions filed by women seeking redress for sexual exploitation and abandonment. The picture becomes clear. Women suffered material deprivation, bodily stress, diminished fertility, and social marginalization simultaneously. The fate of the A-class illustrates how pre-existing gendered institutions were appropriated. Before conquest, A-class were chosen women who performed specialized ritual functions and textile production under state sponsorship. Spanish chroniclers like Garcilaso described them. Post-conquest records show a class being baptized and forced into household service for Spaniards. Excavations at Aclawasi structures document continuity in textile specialization but radical change in who controlled the labor and where the products went. Violence enforced this new order. Skeletal analyses from colonial period cemeteries show increased markers of interpersonal violence among women compared to pre-conquest populations from the same regions. Healed fractures, blunt force trauma, to defensive positions of the forearms. Notarial complaint records include testimonies of beatings tied directly to households run by Spanish men. The osteological and textual evidence converge. Coercive power was maintained through bodily harm and the constant threat of violence. Colonial courts offered formal avenues for redress, though access was severely limited. Audiencia records document petitions by indigenous women seeking maintenance payments, formalization of marriages, or punishment of abusers. Some cases survive, showing women who navigated the legal system with remarkable persistence, but Spanish legal culture prioritized property and status. Indigenous testimony was systematically devalued, constrained by language barriers and procedural requirements designed for a different society. Ecclesiastical courts sometimes intervened to compel marriage or provide sanctuary. Enforcement varied wildly by region and by the disposition of individual clergy. Some women obtained settlements, many others remained vulnerable. The disparities influenced how indigenous families strategized, creating new patterns of alliance and negotiation under occupation. Demographic records from parish registers and tribute lists revealed the emergence of a new population, mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry. Baptismal registers record mothers' names and often note the social origin of fathers. What these documents reveal is that many Spanish men fathered children with indigenous women but did not marry them. The children's status depended entirely on whether fathers chose to acknowledge them. The meta and other forced labor systems compounded women's vulnerability. Colonial labor drafts depleted households of working-age men, leaving women with increased subsistence responsibilities and reduced protection from predation. Ethnohistoric accounts record women taking on new burdens while simultaneously being targeted for sexual access when their menfolk were absent. Archaeological evidence shows shifting production patterns and reduced household craft outputs at Andean domestic sites. Then epidemic disease struck. Smallpox and other introduced pathogens devastated populations. Contemporary chronicles detail waves of mortality. Epidemiological reconstructions using mortality lists and bioarchaeological age profiles show catastrophic decline. The disease didn't affect everyone equally. Community structures collapsed. Orphaning and the loss of male protectors left women exponentially more exposed to exploitation. Mass graves show high juvenile mortality and a demographic signature of societal breakdown. Spanish military culture shaped local dynamics in profound ways. Garrison records describe the size and deployment of military contingents. Chroniclers recorded soldier behavior in newly founded towns, looting, seizure of women after military engagements. Excavations of early colonial barracks show male-dominated spaces built directly adjacent to indigenous quarters, creating both opportunity and inevitability for appropriation. Some missionaries documented these abuses and advocated for change. Bartolomé de las Casas and Dominican friars lobbied the crown. Las Casas' 1552 tract and his letters to Charles V are primary sources. Missionary visitation reports include first-hand accounts of sexual violence, abandonment, and forced cohabitation. Yet even mission compounds show archaeological evidence of dual function: protection and control, shelter and surveillance. The gap between moral teaching and actual practice persisted because economic incentives sustained exploitation. Fiscal records and cadastral surveys reveal profits linked to encomienda outputs, particularly textile production performed by indigenous women under Spanish oversight. Material evidence, loom weights and textile fragments found in colonial contexts, attests to women's central role in this economy. Laws against abuse remained ineffective because the economic system created incentives to maintain control over indigenous women as labor and reproductive capacity. Indigenous communities resisted through legal channels and spatial reorganization. Communal petitions seeking restitution for women seized during raids survive in archives. Archaeological evidence shows communities building defensive features and reorganizing settlements to protect women and children. Resistance existed, but it operated against overwhelming structural violence. What the Spanish conquest did to Inca women was destroy the social, legal, and kinship structures that had protected them, then systematically exploit the vulnerability that destruction created. The evidence, written in archives and in bone, is unambiguous.